Hello, I'm Johnny Diamond, and this is the global story from the BBC World Service. Slicing through the Americas, the Panama Canal is a feat of engineering that has changed the very fabric of world trade. Built against incredible odds by the United States, it's been run by Panama for more than a quarter of a century. But President Trump wants it back. He says China is reaching too deep into Panama's affairs for comfort, and that America is paying too much to use the canal it built. We'll look at the astonishing history behind one of the marvels of the modern world and ask, Panama, whose canal is it anyway? I'm now joined by Michelle Fleury, North America business correspondent for the BBC. She's following the economic agenda of the Trump administration for us and is recently back from a reporting trip on the Panama Canal. Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Johnny. Great to be with you today.
Let's talk Panama Canal. I don't remember this coming up at all in any of the election campaign or what you might call manifesto promises. When did this first turn up?
Yeah, you are not suffering from memory lapse here. This was not actually a major talking point in foreign policy in either the 24 election campaign or his previous presidency. And I think that's what caught everyone off guard, is suddenly out of the blue you got this tweet at Christmas time, basically including comments about Panama Canal, but also about Greenland and Canada becoming the 51st state. So that was the first indication really we got of Donald Trump in this kind of expansionist mood that certainly in the last month or so has been a hallmark of his second term.
The Panama Canal is a disgrace, what took place at the Panama Canal. Jimmy Carter gave it to them for $1, and they were supposed to treat us well. I thought it was a terrible thing to do.
Do we understand what the reasoning is behind the claim on the canal?
It's hard to know. Look, is it a symbolic goal or would it bring economic and political benefits as well? I mean, certainly it is something that Donald Trump has talked about in terms of trying to check China's power, that whole US-China relationship and kind of who's on top. As we know, this is something very important to Trump. And it's also a view shared not just by those inside the White House, but also if you look at the language now coming out of Congress, there seems to be kind of increasingly a shared belief that China's power, certainly along this crucial bit of real estate, needs to be checked.
China essentially has taken it over, and we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let that happen.
You've been in Panama relatively recently. There is some truth behind the claims about Chinese penetration of the Panamanian economy and its role, if not in the operation of the canal itself, then certainly around the waterway.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you listen to what Panama's political leadership are saying, they will tell you that China does not control the Panama Canal. And when we visited it, you know, the people who run the canal and the Miraflores lock and all of that, they were very much at pains to kind of say, you know, we are independent. But what is giving rise to this fear amongst American congressional leaders, amongst Donald Trump right now, is that there has increasingly been a sort of cozying up, if you like, between Panama and China. And it dates back a while. You've got on the economic front things like the increased commercial presence of Chinese firms. So there's a Hong Kong billionaire, Li Ka-shing. His company, Hutchinson, runs and operates some of the ports that are kind of on either side of the canal. At the same time, you also have Panama's position on Taiwan, essentially siding with the Chinese and sort of breaking with the American view on kind of Taiwan and how it's controlled. And so this has increasingly raised eyebrows. And now we've got Marco Rubio heading there to the canal. And I think you see this concern reflected across the board. As I mentioned, Congress, but also Trump. You've also got support from the general public behind this. I mean, I think there was a recent YouGov poll which showed that Americans in general support the idea of this, certainly much more so than they do things like the idea of Canada as a 51st state or Greenland. And so with the wind in his sails, I think we're going to hear more about this, from Donald Trump, the kind of real estate mogul who sees Panama as a piece of real estate he wants to claw back.
There's also the question of transit fees, which have gone up very sharply recently. They've gone up for everyone. It's not just the Americans, but obviously it is America that uses the canal more than any other single nation. That's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And I think, lawmakers might like to look at this and say, oh, this is all, part of a wider conspiracy. I think, to be fair to the Panamanians, if you look back at the investment, so when I went to Panama Canal, we visited the Miraflores lock. That's the sort of bit that tourists are allowed to see. But in reality, that older lock is not used nearly as much as the Neo-Panamax Canal. And that is the lock sort of where the really supercharged, super big tankers go through. That is where the huge amount of cargo and volume goes through and the real money is made. And that was developed at great expense by Panama. And it was that investment that really has pushed up the prices of the transit fees. So it's not really about politics so much as just straightforward maths and kind of recouping the cost of their investment.
What is your smell about how this gets resolved? I mean, presumably you don't expect the Marine Corps to be landing in Panama anytime soon. Is this a play to try and get transit fees reduced, to try and get Panama to push back against Chinese investment?
I mean, I think it's definitely the latter. If they could also bring down transit fees as well, that's another added win. We know this is a very transactional president. And so if you're talking to me about smell tests, as you say, he's not going to stop threatening to use force or threatening to kind of enforce the treaty that was signed between these two countries, which assured the neutrality of the canal. But I think it is a sort of opening gambit. If you just look back at the standoff we've seen between Colombia and the White House over the acceptance of deportation flights of immigrants and the threat of tariffs if they didn't accept these planes. That was resolved within 2 days with the Colombians sort of ceding ground and agreeing in the end to accept the planes. I think Donald Trump is trying to do the same thing here. He's trying to destabilize, throw uncertainty on the Panamanian Authority and government, make them rethink their relationship with China. And by applying this sort of pressure, he's hoping that he will succeed.
Michelle, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So we know President Trump is keen on taking back control of the Panama Canal, but does the US really have a claim to it? Let's take a look at the waterway's history. With me today is Julie Green, Professor of American History at the University of Maryland. Hi, Julie.
Hello, Johnny.
Before we get to the stage in which the United States comes on the scene with the Panama Canal, it was far from the first nation to envisage slicing through the Americas, and a very considerable effort was made, in the 1880s by a team led by the man who'd built the Suez Canal, wasn't it?
The first project was actually a railroad constructed in the 1850s. But then the French government became involved, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had built the Suez Canal. The French tried and failed disastrously to build the canal between 1881 and 1888.
And you say disastrously, and the primary reason for that disaster, leaving aside the vast expenditure, was a terrible loss of life, wasn't it?
It was said to be so much death from disease that top French officials, when they came to the Isthmus of Panama, would bring caskets with them because they so feared they would lose their life during the project. So more than 20,000 deaths in that less than a decade of the French construction effort.
The Americans came on the scene around, the turn of the century, as the 20th century dawned, and brought with them engineering know-how, medical know-how, crucially, to defeat yellow fever, huge amounts of money and energy. And They got it done, but again, not without enormous struggle.
Yes, it was a very difficult project. Absolutely. By the time the U.S. was involved, there had been advances in industrialization, technological advances, and crucially, the cause of yellow fever and malaria had been discovered. So the United States was able to take extensive measures.
And they poured money and energy into the project, vast sums of money in today's money.
The best figure for what the United States spent was $352 million, which in today's money would be somewhere around $19 billion. So it was an expensive project. And the United States also, built an entire civilization there in the Isthmus of Panama, building hospitals, hotels, cafeterias, prisons, housing, everything that would be needed to maintain a labor force of up to 45,000 workers at a time.
And Panama itself was created in part to enable the canal to happen.
I think the origins of how the United States acquired the Panama Canal Zone is a very important part of the story, which often gets neglected when we start talking about these issues. The United States had its sights on building a canal. It tried to negotiate a treaty with Colombia. Panama at that time was a relatively neglected province of Colombia. When the Colombian Senate refused the treaty that the United States had proposed, Theodore Roosevelt, the president of the United States, began to encourage a group of Panamanians who wanted independence. As soon as the revolt succeeded, the Roosevelt administration negotiated a treaty giving it permanent and absolute control over the Canal Zone, a huge region which cut through the heart of the Republic of Panama. The key thing here is that this treaty was negotiated not with any Panamanian, but with the Frenchman, Philippe Bunau Varilla, the man who led a private company, the New Panama Canal Company, which had taken over the digging of the canal when the French government's effort failed. It was said that the new president of Panama, nearly fainted when he learned what Bunau Varilla had given away to the United States with this treaty.
And the canal is up and running for several decades, really, before what you could call canal nationalism starts to build within Panama, and protests begin about the way in which the canal zone is run by America and the canal itself is operated.
From the beginning, there are tensions between the United States and Panama. Panama feels it did not benefit from the construction as it had hoped. It feels the slight to its independence throughout. And so there are various negotiations happening off and on throughout the decades. But these tensions grow worse after World War II in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And then in January 1964, there are massive riots between Panamanians and Zonians and U.S. military personnel that result in 21 Panamanians dead and 4 U.S. military personnel dead.
And from that point on, the idea of either returning or giving the canal and the canal zone to Panama becomes one that is more and more acceptable within the US as well, obviously, as within Panama.
Thinking globally about what's happening at this time, there's a global wave of decolonization. Anything that smacks of colonialism and sacrificing of a country's sovereignty begins to seem inappropriate. So by the mid-60s, there's a great deal of elite consensus in the United States that the canal should be transferred to Panama. Johnson begins negotiations. These are continued by President Nixon and Kissinger, and then ultimately will be completed by Jimmy Carter when he's president with the passing of treaties in 1977.
And those treaties contain within them pretty important guarantees for the United States, because let's not forget, this is a canal that is hugely important for American trade and American prosperity. It's not just a handback. There are conditions within the 1977 treaty.
The 1977 treaties arrange for a gradual transference of the canal to Panama to be completed by December 31st, 1999. There's also a special treaty, the Neutrality Treaty, which guarantees that Panama will run the canal in a way that is fair to all countries on Earth, and allows for U.S. military support if needed to guarantee the neutrality of the canal.
The 77 treaty only squeaks through the Senate, doesn't it? It's far from an overwhelming vote of confidence.
Consider the ways in which the canal was constructed. Theodore Roosevelt very carefully framed the very construction as a selfless gift to world civilization, ultimately erasing the important role, the ways in which Panama sacrificed its own sovereignty, but also supported the project. By erasing Panama's role, the United States was able to present the project as this gift to world civilization. That really shaped over the decades, shaped how Americans saw it. Fast forwarding decades later, that made it hard for Americans to understand why the canal should be transferred to Panama.
But in 1999, the final transfer is completed. The Panama Canal zone is no more. It is now simply Panama, and the canal is fully operated by Panamanians or under Panamanian control, and has been since then. Professor Julie Green, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
If you want more episodes of The Global Story, go to wherever you get your podcasts. Each day, we go into one big international story in detail. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd like to leave a comment, please do so below. Thank you so much, and goodbye.